Before we begin with the stories, I wanted to tell you that the first 5 stories are a collection from the same person and are connected to each other. So enjoy the video and let's get started with the stories. I have many stories from my childhood as well as from my parents' lives before I was born. You can believe what you want, but everything I share here truly happened to me or members of my family. I am a woman in my late 20s, and my parents, a charming lesbian couple, owned a funeral home and a cemetery on the edge of the Alaskan tundra. It was a small family business passed down from my grandfather to my grandmother, Agatha. So it went from generation to generation. Katie, my other mother, was afraid of the whole situation from the beginning. She was convinced that one of us would become possessed because we lived so close field full of corpses, in her words. Gradually, exactly 8 years after they moved there, she learned to respect the land as well as those resting in peace. I was born shortly after this change of heart, yet Katie continued to restrict my access to the cemetery, and although none of us were actually possessed, we still had our share of terrifying experiences both in our house and on the property. I attended a tiny village school every weekday since I could walk. Only about 13 children lived in our village, which is why we were all taught in a single room by a small group of teachers. Katie and her twin sister Gloria were among these teachers. The 3 of us walked to the village and back every day, and her brother Kel tended the property. It was a 20-minute walk, but on rare frost-free days we were allowed to take our bikes, and that was usually the highlight of my life. But on this particular December day, we had to walk. We were only at school until about 4 p.m. that afternoon, but the sun usually set around 3 p.m., so we were mostly enveloped in darkness on the way home. I was about 6 or 7 years old at the time and used my clumsiness as an excuse not to have to walk up the muddy, snow-covered path. Gloria drew the short straw and carried me piggyback up the hill. I rested my head on her back and stared at the cemetery, which slowly came into view between the paper birches and spruce trees. It was a vast field littered with a strange mix of mausoleums and colorful graves of the Inuit and Russian Orthodox citizens. I was always fascinated by the graves and tried to spot the ones I hadn't seen yet. We were almost at the house when I saw a figure standing in the far right corner of the cemetery. It was hard to determine their age or gender, but I could tell it wasn't Agatha or Kel. Visiting hours ended at sunset regardless of the date, so I immediately alerted Katie to the person. Most of the exact details were later reconstructed by my parents and other family members since I was too young for most of these events. But I clearly remember Katie cursing quietly and letting me down from Gloria's back. She ordered me to run into the house and let Kel know he should head to the cemetery. Without hesitation, I suddenly became nimble as a rabbit on the icy ground and ran the last 20 meters to the house. I stormed through the door, ran into the kitchen where I was sure to find Agatha and Kel, and told my uncle about the intruder. Groaning, Kel finished his coffee, which was presumably laced with whiskey, stood up from the table, and dressed heavily. Kel was a large man, about 2 meters tall with broad shoulders and what I called Fredstone fists. He could knock someone out without much effort, and he did so repeatedly. He was extremely protective of his sisters and all the other women in his life, including Gloria and Katie. The whole town respected and feared him at the same time. He was like a living security system. Naturally, I was thrilled by this little bit of excitement in my otherwise rather boring life as my uncle stormed outside without a jacket. With pleading eyes, I turned to Agatha, who seemed hardly impressed by the excitement. She stared at me for a moment, then sighed and pointed to the coat rack next to the door. I got her parka, helped her put it on, and together we went outside. I knew her wife would be anything but thrilled to see me in the cemetery. Agatha picked me up as we reached the wrought iron fence surrounding the property. From a distance, we could see Kel's huge silhouette approaching the smaller figures of Katie and Gloria. The stranger was still about 100 meters away from us. "Let's hide and watch," I whispered to her as I realized Katie hadn't noticed us yet. For a moment I thought my mother would shake her head and go to the others, but to my surprise, she gave me a conspiratorial smile and ducked behind a mausoleum. "We can go to grandmother's grave if we are very quiet," she said with a twinkle in her eyes. She loved the cemetery and had spent her childhood playing there, while simultaneously learning about her ancestors and the people of town. She wanted me to appreciate it just as she did. We scurried from grave to grave, pausing only long enough to ensure the others didn't see us. Katie, Gloria, and Kel were moving quickly too, but were too busy keeping an eye on the figure, standing only about 6 meters from the large grave where my great-grandmother was buried. Our destination. When we reached the grave, Agatha set me down and we crouched behind the stones and wood surrounding my grandmother's altar. At that moment, a queasy feeling began to spread in my stomach. Nervousness grew within me. The stranger stood at the base of the mausoleum built to honor infants who had died before their blessing by the tribe's shaman. This mausoleum was an old, outdated place that did not fully honor Inuit customs. It had been moved closer to the northern section of the cemetery in the 1970s. No one came to this mausoleum anymore because it was seen as disrespectful to the deceased, yet it would have been just as disrespectful to tear it down, so it remained a dilapidated monument perched on the tiny hill of this cemetery corner. Tension hung in the air as Kel, flanked by Katie and Gloria, approached the stranger. I could hear my uncle speaking, probably explaining the cemetery's opening hours and asking if he should drive the man back to town. Kel was always polite and initially gave people the benefit of the doubt before switching into his Hulk mode. Agatha, who had initially giggled seeing her brother towering like a shadow over the intruder, began to cling tighter to me as time passed. It took a while before we realized the person wasn't reacting to Kel. They hadn't even looked in his direction. The stranger continued staring at the spot directly above the mausoleum. Katie and Gloria exchanged nervous glances, and eventually Kel told them to return to the house, but they refused and stepped even closer to his side. When words didn't help, Kel finally attempted the physical approach. Later, he said he could tell the stranger was an old man who seemed frail, and that he didn't want to hurt him. But the man wasn't listening to him, and if he was deaf, Kel had to get his attention somehow. My uncle placed a gentle hand on the man's shoulder, and immediately a wave of nausea overcame him. He doubled over, clutched his stomach, and let out a cry. Agatha ordered me to stay there before jumping out from behind the stones and running to her brother. Kel waved her off, however, and told her and the other women to go back to the house. But everyone stood there petrified. The strange man still hadn't moved, so Katie yelled at him again. She walked around him and waved her hand in front of his face. "You have to leave," I heard her command. "You are not allowed to be here after dark. It is not safe." "No, it isn't," the stranger finally spoke. He lowered his eyes to look directly at Katie. "Are you all right, dear?" He asked in a tone so casual that she stood there petrified. For a moment, she was speechless before looking back at Kel, who was by now on his knees. While Katie was distracted, the man turned and walked toward the exit. As he approached my hiding spot, I fully intended to stand up and run away, but I was paralyzed. It felt as if my body was being weighed down and I was sinking into the earth. I whimpered, buried my face in my arms, and prayed to God and my great-grandmother for safety. The crunching of ice and leaves got louder, and I knew Agatha had realized my predicament and said something to the others because I heard Katie scream. Finally, I found the courage to look up, just in time to see the man walk right past me. He didn't even look at me, but as he passed, he whispered, "Good night, blue eyes," almost melodic voice. Immediately, my body relaxed, and I jumped up. I watched the man practically float out of the cemetery and disappear toward the street. Katie came to me and said we had to take my uncle to the hospital. It turned out Kel needed emergency surgery because his appendix had burst. He was convinced the old man had cursed him by touch. Even Agatha, dear but superstitious, doubted this theory. There was no malicious reason in Kel's behavior toward the man, so why would he curse him? That wasn't the last time we saw this strange man. In the following weeks, he appeared 2 or 3 more times, always standing at the dilapidated infant mausoleum, staring at the sky. He never spoke and never bothered anyone, and from then on, he always came in daylight. I sometimes snuck out and watched him from my great-grandmother's grave. It was noticeable that he was a white man, which remained a mystery to me. I had a theory that he was Katie and Gloria's biological father. Abandoned them at a young age, but Katie quickly disproved this theory. Her father had died in the early 90s. But to me, that meant nothing. It could still have been him. The last time I saw him was in early February of the following year. It was snowing heavily, and I was helping Agatha and Kel check the graves and mausoleums to make sure they were all sealed. Sometimes relatives of the deceased performed rituals on their recently departed by placing ceremonial offerings on their bodies. But they didn't always return the graves to their original state. We tried to ensure no graves would be flooded during the next snowmelt. As we approached my grandmother's grave, I heard Agatha draw in a sharp breath but keep walking. I looked immediately to the old mausoleum and saw the old man's back. "Good morning," I called out to him. "There is no such morning, blue eyes," I heard him answer over the wind. I started laughing because it sounded like something Gloria would say after a night of drinking. But suddenly I felt a ball of sadness contract in my stomach. I began to cry and looked up at Agatha with a sad expression. It was the first time I truly felt fear, and it almost brought me to my knees. Agatha picked me up and took me into the house, where I immediately felt better. The man was never seen on the property again. I was a little sad about it, but the adults were relieved. They didn't like the influence he had had on us. This is a story from the time when my parents had just started living together. Katie grew up in a fairly large town just a few hours from our village. Her mother was a nurse and occasionally brought medical supplies to the more remote regions of the state, providing vaccinations for those who needed them. On one of these trips, she met Agatha and her family. The two girls were about 9 or 10 years old at the time and quickly became friends. Grandmother Mary, Katie's mother, sometimes let Katie and her twin sister Gloria stay overnight with Agatha's family while she visited other villages. When the two became teenagers, Katie and Agatha began secretly dating. Eventually, they revealed the truth to their families. Grandmother Mary, a devout Catholic, took the news surprisingly well. Agatha's parents, Pawpaw and Ma, were a bit concerned, however. They had never dealt with homosexuality in their tribe and believed their ancestors might punish them for allowing the girls' relationship. But after the community and the tribal council voted on it, everyone agreed. As long as Agatha and her family kept their faith and respected the traditions of their tribe, no harm would come from this union. After receiving the blessing of both families, Katie and Agatha were allowed to move in together. They were just 17 years old at the time. That was common in our village. There were no ceremonies. They simply moved from separate houses into a shared one, which symbolized the engagement. The house they moved into was small and located about half a kilometer from the main building, the house we later moved into. At that time, however, it was Paw and Ma's house. Katie and Agatha swear that the cottage used to be a charming little cottage with a beautiful red door and matching shutters. All I know is that today it is a dilapidated building that gives you splinters just by looking at it. It worked most weekdays with her father. Her older brother was a fisherman and had no interest in the family business, so my mother was next in line for the inheritance. She loved the cemetery and the funeral home because she felt she could offer people a place of peace and farewell during the most difficult times of their lives. Sometimes she worked long hours, so Katie spent most of her time either teaching in town or at home cleaning and cooking. At that time, she wasn't particularly bothered that the cemetery was right behind her house. It was a quiet place, and she didn't think much of it. One afternoon, she was outside cleaning the windows. Music was playing from the radio inside the house, so she didn't notice the car approaching on the gravel path until it was right behind her. She didn't recognize the vehicle. It didn't belong to any member of Agatha's family, so she immediately stopped cleaning to greet the stranger. Katie was a true debutante, and hospitality was very important to her. The man who got out of the truck was white, which in itself wasn't unusual. There were some white families in the valley, even a few Russians. They rarely came to this part of the property. Most business took place in the main building where the funeral home was located. Assuming the man was lost, Katie waved to the stranger. He must have been in his late 30s or early 40s. He was handsome with an almost rugged but friendly demeanor. The only thing unusual about him seemed to be his lack of a coat. He was wearing only a flannel shirt and jeans. However, it was 30 degrees Fahrenheit, about 1 degree Celsius, and in this part of the country where it's sometimes dark all day, that wasn't the time to be outside without a coat. Katie herself was only outside because the dirty windows were driving her crazy. "Can I help you?" she asked as he slowly walked to the porch. "Do you have a dog?" the man asked breathlessly while looking around the property as if searching for something. No dog," Katie replied. The stranger pointed to the wooded area on the east side of the property. "There's a dog in a trap right by the path over there. Do you know who it might belong to? It's brown with a black muzzle." Katie immediately stepped off the porch and looked toward the trees. "I have no idea. Couldn't it be freed from the trap?" Katie was and is a huge animal lover. She has a habit of bringing stray animals and injured wildlife home. "I don't have any tools, the man replied, pointing to the trunk of his truck. "Do you have a crowbar or maybe a screwdriver? I could probably take the trap apart if you could calm the dog down while I do it." It didn't occur to Katie that it would have been better to call someone stronger to help him, or that he drove from another part of the property, even though he should have come from the woods if he'd actually been there. All she knew was that a dog was hurt and she wanted to help. She ran into the house, searched through the chest of tools Agatha's brother had given them when they moved in, and found everything he requested as well as a few flashlights. Then she followed him to his truck. Back then, she wasn't yet jaded by a world full of criminals and perverts, so she didn't think twice about going with another good Samaritan. The man drove fast, and when they reached the edge of the woods, he turned off the path and took a shortcut most hunters in the area used. Only then did Katie notice that the man had no gun rack in the cab of his truck and that he was hardly dressed for a hunting trip. She glanced the floor behind her seat, looking for a jacket or sweater he might have taken off, but found nothing of the sort. When the truck stopped, she asked him about his clothes and suggested getting a coat from her brother-in-law's cabin. He refused immediately. "My coat is with dog," he explained while gesturing toward the path. The poor guy looked cold, so I wanted him to be at least a little comfortable while waiting for me. That reassured Katie. She thought he was a nice guy taking care of a dog. They walked along the path, which Katie had only stepped on once or twice before. As children, she and the other kids had explored the woods, but they never went into this area for fear of getting shot by. Without daylight, they were safe from hunters, but there were still other dangers like bears and foxes. The man walked ahead, shining the flashlight on the path to make sure they were going the right way. They walked for almost half an hour before Katie stopped and scanned her surroundings. She asked if they would arrive at the dog soon. The man nodded. "It's just up ahead by the pass," he said, gesturing to a spot off the path. A little bit further, he added, turning to her. He smiled a smile that Katie still describes today as charming in a Ted Bundy kind of way. As if sensing her discomfort, the man to make conversation. "My name is Aaron, by the way. I live up by the border. And are you from around here?" Katie was confused. She wanted to throw an annoyed, "No kidding" at him. After all, he had just picked her up from her house. What do you think, that she was a tourist cleaning windows to pass the time? Instead of being rude, she just hummed in agreement and fixed her gaze on the path while searching for the dog with the flashlight. "Are you married?" Aaron asked suddenly. Katie asked him back why he thought that, and he reminded her that she had mentioned her brother-in-law. "Isn't your husband home?" "Wife, actually," Katie corrected. "But she will be home soon." Katie thought it was important to add this, even if it wasn't true. Agatha wasn't expected for a few hours, but Katie wanted him to think someone could check on her soon. Aaron was silent for a moment. They reached a rocky incline on the path, and he seemed to concentrate on it. After a while, he suddenly began to laugh. "That's pretty hot. 2 women and all." Katie was relieved he didn't react like many other people who learned of her relationship for the first time, often with rejection or disgust. But Aaron's reaction made her uncomfortable in a different way, almost even worse. To remain polite, she forced a short fake laugh. "Oh, sure," she murmured. "How do you do it, actually?" he asked suddenly, stopping to turn toward her. Katie hoped fervently that he didn't mean what she feared. "How do we do what?" she asked, though she already guessed the answer. How do you sleep with each other?" Aaron shrugged casually. Disgusted, Katie took a step back. "That is none of your business." She tried to remain calm, but the sudden change in his attitude made her nervous. "Can we just get the dog now?" she asked. "Oh, yeah." Aaron looked around as if he had completely forgotten why they were there in the first place. He laughed embarrassedly and shook his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there is no dog," he finally said. "I just brought you here to have a good time." His casual attitude made Katie pause for a moment. She thought she must have misheard, but when he began to undo his pants, she knew she had understood him correctly. In Katie's tellings of this event, small details change occasionally. But one thing remains constant: her reaction in exactly that moment. She gave him no chance. Without hesitating, she hit him repeatedly with the flashlight on his head, neck, and chest. She hit him as often as she could until he went down. When she was sure he was unconscious, she turned and ran back the way they came. She didn't know exactly where she was, but she guessed she would find the truck if she stayed on the path, and she was right. She saw the truck at the edge of the field, right at the entrance of the path. She checked the vehicle and was relieved that the man had left the keys in the ignition. Katie drove the truck across the field to the main building, where she found Paw, Agatha, and Agatha's brother Kel. The 3 were horrified when they heard what happened. The men immediately set off into the woods to find the injured man, while Agatha notified the authorities. In this case, Jimmy, the local sheriff. A man with a collection of European muskets and 3 dogs that could tear the skin off a man's bones on command arrived soon. When Paw and Kel returned, the latter was dragging Aaron by 1 foot behind him. Aaron was put in a makeshift jail cell, a concrete room at Jimmy's house, and remained there until the police from the nearest town arrived to conduct an official investigation. As it turned out, Aaron was a fisherman from the coast who visited friends in the area once or twice a year. During one of these visits, he had gone to Kel at the funeral home with his friends, where they casually mentioned that Katie was home and presumably alone. In a moment when he had time to himself, Aaron borrowed a truck, drove to her house, and found the beautiful Katie alone, as he had been promised. It remained unclear why he thought it was okay to lure a woman into the woods to molest her. Aaron was a relatively good-looking man and seemed mostly normal. In the end, he got a short prison sentence and was banned from our village. Not much more could be done since he hadn't ultimately done anything to Katie. After all, he was the one who was hurt the most. That was one of the rare occasions where something terrible happened on our property that had nothing to do with the cemetery or the funeral home. But it was definitely the first time one of my mothers was confronted the true evil of the world. As you surely know, as a child I was never allowed to go into the cemetery alone until I was 11 or 12 years old. Until then, I was always glued to my parents' side when we entered the grounds. My Uncle Kel used to be the preferred babysitter when neither of my mothers was available. He is a reliable guy willing to take out anyone who poses a danger to me or my family. One morning, when I was 6 years old, my mothers had to go to school to discuss an upcoming festival. Kel wasn't necessarily a natural when it came to dealing with children. He was nice and did his best when he had to watch me, but he never really got the hang of how to talk or play with me. That day he decided to play hide and seek with me. That was nothing new for me. I played it constantly with my mothers and aunts, but they always made a point of explaining the rules thoroughly beforehand. Stay in the yard, don't go into the cemetery, don't hide in caves or animal burrows, come out of your hiding place when the seeker calls, Oli Oli oxen free. Uncle Kel didn't know these rules, and I didn't feel like reminding him. I wanted to find a new place to hide. If I had to cower in a chicken coop one more time, I would probably scream. Kel hated hiding, so he always volunteered to seek. That was an added bonus for me because when I played with my parents and aunts, I almost always had to be the seeker. I was slow, and they were competitive. They never gave me a chance. You have to count to 100, I explained to my uncle as I led him to the barn, which would be my base. And you aren't allowed to cheat. He nodded, turned to the wall of the barn, and began to count. I took off running before he even got to 1. I didn't plan on hiding behind a tombstone or mausoleum. Even at my young age, I knew how disrespectful that would be. But there was a small grove in the middle of the yard that called to me. A few weeks prior, I had discovered that one of the trees had a low-hanging branch I could climb with a running start. Kids at school climbed similar trees on the playground. I had done it with them once, but my Aunt Gloria, who worked as a teacher at my school, along with my mother Katie, was on duty at the time and forced me to climb down immediately. This time there was no adult around to tell me no. With at least a 60-second head start, I sprinted through the cemetery to my destination. The tree, which I later named Ulalume after the poem by Edgar Allan Poe, greeted me with yellowish leaves and white branches that looked like outstretched arms waiting for a hug. Without hesitating, I took a running start and jumped when I was in range. With a lucky strike, I managed to grab the lowest branch and pull myself up on the first try. I was only about 1.5 meters above the ground, yet it felt like I had climbed a mountain. Since I was still easy to see in my light blue coat, I climbed a few branches higher and hid behind a large cluster of leaves that hadn't fallen yet. When I was finally sitting comfortably, Kel finished counting and had been searching the yard for a few minutes. He looked in the usual places a 6-year-old might hide, places I had often chosen in previous games of hide and seek. but he also looked in some new places that I mentally noted for next time. From my little hiding spot, I could see him well and laugh about him without fear of being discovered. He was far away from my tree. I watched as he scratched his head and rechecked the places he had already searched. Then he went into the house to look for me there. By this time I was getting stiff and leaned against the trunk of the tree to wait for him to come back out. The air was still, and I could hear birds chirping in the surrounding trees. Had I not been sitting on a narrow branch about 6 meters above the ground, I might have been able to relax and fall asleep. But I remained alert, hoping to see my uncle again soon. Then I felt a tingling in the back of my neck. It was a similar feeling to when my mothers gently ran their fingers through my hair or scratched my back. This feeling relaxed me. I looked around and noticed how quiet this small grove inside the old cemetery was. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of euphoria. I could only compare to anything else many years later. I suddenly had the urgent need to go to my mother's, to tell them I loved them and hug them. At the same time, I was overcome with guilt because I had broken the rules and entered the cemetery. I began to climb quickly out of the tree, but in doing so, I slipped from a branch and fell about 2.5 meters to the ground. Later, I would learn that I broke my wrist and thumb, but in that moment, I felt no pain. I just had to get back to my parents. In my dazed state, I decided the best way back to town would be through the woods behind the cemetery, probably because I was closer to the woods than to the road. But the woods were dense and full of traps set and forgotten by hunters. Luckily, I didn't step in any of the traps that day. There was a fairly clear path my mother, Agatha, and her siblings had made when they were young. I stayed on this path, but at some point, the feeling of euphoria began to turn into a feeling of dread. I suddenly had the feeling something was chasing me. I remember crying and calling for Kel to find me. Finally, everything went black, and I lost consciousness. When I came to, I was lying in a pile of leaves staring at the night sky. Pain shot through my right arm, and my feet burned. Slowly, I sat up and looked around. I was still in the woods. It took a moment to orient myself. I recognized where I was. I was only a few meters from the path and began walking toward the cemetery. My jacket was gone, as were my shoes and socks. I have no idea what happened to them. My small feet were ice cold and hurt as I walked over the rocky ground. As I stepped out of the woods onto the cemetery, I saw red lights flashing from the house. Immediately, I knew they were there because of me. For a moment, I considered turning back and spending my life in the woods, but I kept walking. When I was about halfway across the cemetery, I heard someone calling my name. It was my mother, Katie. She was the stricter of my two mothers, with an Irish temper and a hand perfectly suited for scolding. But when I saw her running through the cemetery gate, I felt a wave of relief. I couldn't run because I was too exhausted and could only raise my left arm, but I called for her while hot tears ran down my cheeks. Katie picked me up, pressed me close, and didn't scold me for running away, not wearing a jacket, or being barefoot. She only asked if I was okay and told me she loved me. Even in that moment, as adrenaline shot through my veins, I was relieved she pitied me. I was far too exhausted to get in trouble. Katie took me into the house where a hysterical Agatha waited with her sisters and my Aunt Gloria. But I wasn't allowed to stay home. When they realized I was injured and had been alone in the woods for almost 12 hours, I was taken to the waiting ambulance and driven to the hospital in the nearest town. The next day, I was released with a bright cast and ordered to stay indoors for at least 72 hours. The shaman to visit us the next day. He had been called my grandfather after I told him what had led me into the woods. My parents stayed with me while I told the shaman about the experience. I described to him how happy I had felt and how much I felt the need to find my parents and tell them I loved them. So much so that I had gone into the woods, which I feared more than any grave or mausoleum. After all was said and done, the shaman went to the grove where I had hidden and began to bless and cleanse it with sage and incense. He told my mothers that I had likely been influenced by a spirit. He believed to have been the child of a deceased person who missed their parents. Katie, who was less superstitious than her wife, was skeptical of this explanation. While she believed in spirits, she didn't think it possible for them to take control of the living. But she had no better explanation for why a 6-year-old had gone into the woods and passed out. So they allowed the shaman his rituals and tightened their rule that I was never allowed to enter the cemetery alone. Uncle Kel, who was deeply shaken after the incident, was the only one who scolded me. I was surprised. He was usually a laid-back guy who never really blamed me. But he had been very afraid of losing me forever. And when he learned that it all happened only because I broke a rule I knew very well, he lost his composure. This was one of many experiences I had in my childhood. I wish I knew more about what caused it. But even the leaders of my tribe have no explanation. They simply use the story to warn children against wandering on consecrated ground. When I was still a baby, my Aunt Dawn's boyfriend Eddie started working for us. He had no other qualifications except that he was strong and willing to work with the dead, so he was hired. Eddie was a bit weird, according to Agatha, obviously in love with Dawn. Dawn, the sweetest summer child, thought nothing of it. She was convinced he was just a shy boy who didn't know how to talk to people, let alone girls. She, the prettiest girl in her class, took it upon herself to befriend older teenagers. She was just 15 years old at the time. Eddie was 17. I want to make clear from the beginning. This story contains no violence against my aunt. Now, a bit about our property. It is a true treasure trove of bizarre graves and mausoleums, but there are also caves and shelters near the woods where nature remained untouched. Although hardly any animals use these dwellings, we leave the places alone so they can serve as refuges during blizzards. On the morning Eddie started, Katie found him sleeping in one of these caves. He hadn't there an hour. A few hours later, he came into the house asking for a snack, even though he had hardly done any work. Katie made him a sandwich, and after he ate it, she asked him to go to the funeral home and help Agatha with inventory. Eddie nodded and disappeared through the doors leading into the parlor. Less than 10 minutes later, Agatha came in, and Katie asked how his work was going. Agatha looked confused, and when Katie told her what she had assigned Eddie to do, she said. Together the two searched for him and finally found him sleeping in one of the empty coffins in the showroom. Annoyed and slightly concerned, my parents asked if he had gotten enough sleep the night before. They offered to let him sleep the rest of the day in the guest room and do his tasks the next day. Eddie apologized and declined the offer. "It's just a hangover, I'm fine again," he said with a blank face and monotone voice. After that, he got to work. He helped Agatha with inventory, repaired the bulldozer, and even repainted the cemetery's entrance gate. By evening, he was a model employee. Dawn brought him some stew out, but I had been screaming and crying all afternoon due to an earache. My mothers didn't want to expose anyone outside the family to this chaos. A few minutes later, Dawn came back and got Agatha. She said she could hear Eddie screaming but couldn't find him. The two sisters went outside, and indeed his screaming was clearly audible. But he was nowhere to be seen, neither inside nor outside. They followed the screams to the cemetery, which was the easy part. The cemetery was quite large, and sounds traveled strangely there. Some places echoed, in others, sounds were muffled. My grandfather always said the restless spirits lived in the quieter areas, and sound didn't carry far there because they needed a little more peace before finding their rest. That day, Eddie probably made many ghosts angry because he screamed almost continuously. Agatha and Dawn split up, searching first the caves where Katie had seen him in the morning, and then combing through the graves. After about 20 minutes, Dawn called Agatha to one of the prepared graves near the fence. It was covered since a funeral was to take place there the next day. Eddie lay in the shallow grave, clutching his injured knee to his chest and screaming. Dawn stood stunned above him. She was too small to help the big guy, especially since he wasn't in his right mind. Agatha was also momentarily paralyzed, but when she saw the scratches on Eddie's face, she suspected it must have been an animal attack. She jumped into the grave and turned Eddie onto his back to examine him better. But as soon as he was on his back, he began to scream that was hurting his eyes and scratched his face. Agatha and Dawn tried to calm him, but when that failed, Dawn ran to get Kel from the house. Kel was much bigger than Eddie and could easily overpower him if necessary. When he arrived, he sent his sisters into the house and asked them to call the village doctor, as he would take Eddie to him immediately. They watched as Kel loaded Eddie into the truck and drove off toward town. The next morning, they learned what happened. Eddie was a confused wreck and spoke mostly broken Inupiaq. When he finally formed a coherent sentence, he described a huge, hairless, dog-like creature that had attacked him when he turned his back. It had bitten him in the shoulder and turned him into a wolf. Being very superstitious, believed Eddie had been attacked by a chickern, an Inuit version of a hellhound. The chickern is said to be an oversized, terrifying creature similar to a hairless ferret with huge fangs. However, there was no lore stating that a bite from a chickern could transform a human. Nevertheless, Eddie did have a rather bad bite wound on his right shoulder. The doctor explained it was a dog bite that was severely infected. Although rabies was rarely a problem in our area, Eddie was still put in quarantine. We stayed away from stray dogs for a while. Eddie never really recovered, neither physically nor mentally. Not that he was particularly stable before. He constantly had to tear his own skin off and occasionally bit those trying to help him. Luckily, no one was seriously injured. Saddest of all, however, was that Eddie ended his life 2 years later. He slit his wrists with a silver knife, a gift his mother had received from a shaman. The family believed this was the only way to free him from the beast that had possessed him. When I was about 16, my cousins Lena and Vincent visited me from New Mexico. Both were a few years older than me, but we always got along very well. I am the youngest grandchild on Katie's side of the family and the only grandchild on Agatha's side, which is why I was always especially happy to see these two. They stayed with us for a few days in the summer. Both were in college by then and wanted to escape the heat before returning to their strict schedule. Their father, Katie's brother Max, was also there. Max was a paleontologist and planned to dig in the tundra during his stay. About the second week of their visit, Katie and Gloria accompanied Max to his excavation site while Agatha stayed behind to look at young people. Since she was feeling a little unwell, she asked the three of us to do some of the work in the cemetery she had started. Weeds were rarely a problem for us, but grass, flowers, and other plants died due to the volatile weather. Every June and July, we went to all the graves to clean them. Usually, I was exempt from these tasks because my cousins were visiting, but Agatha didn't want the work to pile up. Besides, she promised to drive us into town the next day and treat us to dinner and a movie if we helped. Vincent was surprisingly squeamish when it came to the cemetery. He constantly asked why the mausoleums opened so easily and was afraid something jump out. It got so bad that Lena and I couldn't take it anymore and asked him to sit on one of the concrete benches along the fence. When he went there, he suddenly groaned and held his nose. "What the hell is that stench?" he called out. In my family, there was an unspoken rule never to speak of hell or demons inside the cemetery gates, so I immediately shushed my cousin and asked him to say a prayer aloud for forgiveness. But he ignored me and instead pointed to one of the mausoleums. "Why is that one over there broken?" he asked. I went over to see what he was talking about and was shocked to notice that one of our newer mausoleums, the one where the village shaman's late mother was buried, had a large crack in the middle. It looked like it had been roughly smashed and then poorly put back together. The intense smell streaming from it indicated that the body was already in the middle of decomposition. For some idiotic reason, I pulled my t-shirt over my nose, crouched down, and began to examine the grave closer. I pushed some of the smaller stones aside and looked through the resulting hole. Of course, the first thing I saw was the decaying hand of the old woman. She had died 2 months prior at the age of 102, and her skin had been thin as paper then. So her bones were already visible under the remaining tissue scraps. The rest of the body was still connected, and everything that had been buried seemed to still be there. When the initial shock of seeing a decomposed corpse subsided, however, I noticed something terrifying. The body was aligned with the head to the north. In Inupiaq culture, only men are buried with their heads to the north. Women are buried with their heads to the south because they get cold more easily. We couldn't possibly have mixed something like that up. Even if it had happened, the many people who visited the body before the burial would have said something. It would have been immediately noticed that she was aligned incorrectly. This realization sent me into a panic. Someone had broken in and not only desecrated a grave, which is disturbing in any cultural belief system, but also repositioned the body so that it could negatively influence the spirit of the deceased. This woman could now be suffering in the land of souls. Without a word to my cousins, I ran into the house to wake Agatha and ask her what we should do. Agatha had often told me stories about grave robbers from her childhood. These were fishermen from another village who stole jewelry and furs our dead were wrapped in. When I finally roused my mother from her NyQuil-dampened rest, she put on her coat and followed me out to the damaged grave. Vincent was now standing outside the cemetery, pale as a sheet. Obviously, he hadn't told Lena about our discovery because she was on the other side of the grounds picking wilted flowers from the earth. Agatha called Lena over and ordered her to take her brother inside. When Lena came over and noticed Vincent's trembling state, she mocked him in a shrill voice. "Oh, little boy, did you see a ghost?" Agatha urged him into the house and told him to say a prayer for forgiveness. Then she asked Lena to call the police in the nearest town. Such matters had to be handled by a higher authority than what our village could offer. Surprisingly, Agatha allowed me to stay and help her examine the grave. I attributed this to her being groggy from NyQuil. She was visibly shocked by the condition of the grave and the body inside. Her previous experiences with grave desecration involved greedy white men looking for high-quality ivory or labradorite jewelry. That was somehow easier for her to accept than the idea that someone would intentionally the spirit of a deceased person. The police arrived along with the shaman from another village. Our village's shaman couldn't perform an appropriate ceremony due to his close relationship with the deceased. We were assured that the woman's spirit was now resting in peace. There were no suspects for the desecration of the grave, and nothing like that ever happened again. The police therefore did not consider it necessary to pursue the incident further. As you can imagine, my refused to ever enter the cemetery after this incident. Growing up, and to this day, I have loved everything creepy and uncanny. Supernatural and paranormal stories were my favorite reading and movies, no matter how much they scared me. I was fascinated by ghosts, cemeteries, and everything eerie, and loved the adrenaline rush of terror. So I said yes when, as a teenager, I was invited to play hide and seek in my town's largest and supposedly most haunted cemetery. The cemetery was managed by the church it surrounded, a decent cathedral surrounded by graves for a mile in every direction. My friend and I had planned to go on a day when we knew no one would be there to kick us out for playing among the graves. The week we planned the game, it had stormed constantly, bringing cold air after a heat wave. Day we went was the first day. That week, it didn't rain. Wet or not, we had to go now or wait out another week of storms. Due to the cold the rain had brought, thick fog lay over the town. It was perfect for a creepy game of hide and seek in a cemetery. We all met at my best friend John's place, who lived even 3 or 4 blocks away. John loved the paranormal just as much as I did, but was also a huge scaredy cat. So the whole thing couldn't happen at night. It was barely past noon when we set off. Our mutual friend Hannah, who had come up with the idea, as was my boyfriend at the time, and 2 other people to play the game. Greg was a reassurance for John since Greg was a skeptic regarding all these things. We had no major trouble getting in and reached the cathedral after some walking. Although it was still quite bright outside for a cloudy day with thick fog, the cemetery felt darker. Maybe it was because of the many trees and graves, or maybe our superstition. Either way, John and I got a queasy feeling while Hannah explained she would be the seeker first since it was her idea. John whispered in my ear about his bad feeling, but telling him about my own would have only scared him more. Since I really wanted to play with everyone, I told him not to worry, ignoring my own instincts. All for the adrenaline rush, right? And if anyone sees a ghost, make sure you record it, Hannah said. Greg rolled his eyes but said nothing. He was right. Almost everyone in town had a personal creepy story about this cemetery, but no one had ever provided proof. And if pros couldn't capture anything, how were 4 teenagers supposed to manage it? I was just about to ask if that was the reason we were here when John tugged at my shirt and asked if everyone heard that noise. He said it sounded like the laughter of a little girl. Hannah laughed excitedly and told us the story of the small children who supposedly the place. But they are just some of the many entities here, she announced happily to the group. John wanted to say something else, but Hannah clapped her hands and told us to scatter as she turned around and began to count. John gave me a pleading look, but I returned it with an encouraging smile and ran off. I hoped Greg would follow me so we could have a little fun while waiting to be found. But Greg was a competitive person, so he played the game seriously. I hid behind a few trees and large graves, always respectfully watching where I stepped, before finding the perfect spot behind a mausoleum. The small building was surrounded by tall bushes with just enough space in between to hide. It was one of those obvious places a seeker would likely overlook because they were too obvious, if that makes sense. Maybe 5 minutes later, I heard footsteps. I crouched low and saw a man approaching me. As he got closer, I heard Greg whisper my name. I thought he had a similar idea for hiding, but when I wanted to follow him and scare him, I jumped out and there was no one. I looked around confused, but there was no one to be seen. A cold breeze brushed through me, and I shivered. Maybe I should change locations. About 10 minutes later, I had found a new hiding spot between a grave and a tree right behind it. I kept peeking around the corner to make sure I couldn't see anyone who might spot me. Maybe 2 minutes had passed when I heard the crunch of gravel on the paths. I looked over the grave and saw Hannah and John walking on another path. 6 rows of graves between us. I giggled quietly as I watched them looking behind trees and upwards, as if any of us would have thought to climb a tree. Greg called Hannah, followed by my name, as if he wanted to mock us to come out. I pulled my leg back when I felt something touch me. Relieved, I saw it was just a leaf brushing me. Hannah and John walked further away from me, and I had the brilliant idea to follow them. I thought they would never think to look behind them. Just as I took a step, something suddenly grabbed my ankle and pulled me down. I don't know exactly how it happened, but in the same moment I looked down to see what it was. I lost my balance and hit my head against a tombstone. Lying on the ground, my vision was blurry. I couldn't see what it was, but something began to pull me. I lay on my stomach, screaming and pulling at grass and weeds to grab something that could hold me. Hannah and John weren't even out of sight when I fell, and I was sure they would hear me, but they didn't come. Finally, my fingers found purchase on the edge of a flat tombstone, one of those slabs that lie on the ground. It wasn't much, but enough to prop myself up against the pulling. Suddenly, it let go of me. I don't know if my blurred vision came from the impact or my tears, but I saw nothing and jumped up as fast as possible. I ran in the direction I had last seen someone. But as I started running, I heard footsteps behind me. Something was chasing me. I almost collided with Greg, who looked at me in panic and asked why I was covered in mud and if I knew my forehead was bleeding. But I didn't care. "Something is chasing me," I yelled. Greg assured me he had seen me running and no one was behind me. Game or not, we were leaving. We ran to where we had last seen Hannah and John, and Greg held my hand. I cried the whole time and told him I had last seen them in this direction. It didn't take long to find them, and even less time to leave the cemetery. Greg didn't really believe what had happened. He knew me well enough to know I don't scare easily. He refused to call it ghosts, insisted it was something else. Maybe a crazy homeless person. Hannah was angry. She scolded me for not taking out my phone to record something, and got even angrier when I sarcastically replied that my phone was the last thing on my mind in that moment. 2 months later, I finally watched what Hannah had recorded. I wished I hadn't. You could clearly see me peeking out from behind a grave, but directly behind me, where a large tree should have stood, was a large dark figure bending over me. The camera had also recorded no sound. Not a single noise, not even my screams. Just static white noise. Hannah sent the footage to a local paranormal investigation team, who immediately dismissed it as a fake. Years have passed since then, and every time I drive past that cemetery, I feel that thing staring at me as if waiting for me to return. But I haven't. I haven't entered a cemetery since then, and if you visit one, make sure to respect the dead. I think before I start, I have to give you a little context, as the story is quite long. My boyfriend at the time and I had the absolute definition of a toxic relationship. If I wrote everything down, it could be the definition, the dictionary. He was really a difficult person, and I was very insecure. He cheated on me constantly, we always fought. And I forgave him every time because I was afraid of being alone. To my own doom, I suppose. I eventually learned my lesson, but that is not the story I want to share with you today. No, this happened when he wanted to take me out for my 25th birthday. I was very excited. He had booked a romantic getaway at a beach resort, and I was thrilled. He hadn't done anything so romantic in years, and I suspected this was his way of apologizing for his latest cheating escapades. This nice gesture softened me a bit. To make a long story short, we arrived at the beach resort, and for my birthday, which fell on a Saturday, he had organized a nice dinner at a nearby restaurant. So we went to the restaurant, and the food was good, but he kept staring at the waitress, which really bothered me. I confronted him about it, and he told me I was manipulative and overreacting. The matter escalated, and when we got back to the hotel room, we had a huge fight. He claimed because he paid for the weekend, he could effectively kick me out of the room, and he did just that. On my birthday, he took the room key card away, and I was beside myself with rage. I didn't know if the reception would give me a new card, so I went for a walk to cool off. I was absolutely furious, crying, and my phone was in my purse, which was naturally in the hotel room I couldn't enter. It must have been around 9 or 10 p.m. I can't say exactly because I wasn't wearing a watch. As I walked further away from the hotel, the area became visibly more rundown. Eventually, I reached a bridge with a stream underneath and decided to sit on the bank there and listen to the water. I had just gone down when I heard the hum of motorcycles stopping on the bridge above me. I heard a couple of men get off and shout that they should grab that girl. I wasn't sure if they meant me, but the whole situation was incredibly creepy. I hid under the bridge as small as possible. I stayed there for a whole hour, unsure if I should come out or wait longer. When I finally found the courage to stick my head out, I saw no one. The area was quiet, and a sign for a nearby cemetery caught my eye. The path led back toward the hotel, so I went in that direction. The cemetery was quite well kept, somewhat small with a church at the end. I went inside to calm down. I sat next to a tombstone, read the names, and tried to sort my thoughts. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. Immediately, I thought of the men with the motorcycles and ran without looking back to the side of the church. When I got there, I peered carefully around the corner to see if anyone was there, but no one was to be seen. Maybe they were already gone. I settled down behind the building, tired from all the events. I had also had a few drinks, but the effect had worn off due to the fear and the long walk. I leaned into the corner and fell asleep. I woke up a few hours later. It was now pitch black. The sky was clear and a fine mist lay over the cemetery. It was freezing cold, and I realized I shouldn't be in a cemetery in the middle of the night. As I looked around, I realized no streetlights were on. I felt incredibly vulnerable, as if I could be attacked at any moment. My only reference point was a floodlight in the church, illuminating the entrance. I began slowly walking down the path to leave the cemetery when I heard footsteps again. This time I tried to tell myself it could just be someone, maybe a priest, but when I turned around, no one was there. The footsteps stopped as soon as I looked. My heart raced, and I wondered if I was just imagining it all. But just as I was leaving the cemetery, I heard the dull sound of footsteps behind me one last time. This time I didn't turn around. My whole body was covered in goosebumps, and I knew I shouldn't look. I finally got back to the hotel lobby. It was past 3 a.m. The employee at the reception was on his phone and didn't even notice me. I asked him to make me a new card, but he refused since I wasn't the one who made the booking. After much back and forth, he finally accompanied me to open the door. My boyfriend wasn't in the room. I don't know where he had gone, but I fell onto the sofa and slept. In the morning, I packed my things, and since he still hadn't returned, I left the hotel. I am happy to say that since that day, I started showing more backbone and ended the relationship soon after, but that night in the cemetery haunts me to this day. In Texas, just outside of Houston, there is a suburban subdivision with a dark and unusual history. The neighborhood was built in the 1970s on a site that was once a cemetery from the 1800s. Instead of relocating the bodies, the developers merely removed the tombstones and left the human remains untouched. Over time, as the community expanded, residents began discovering graves, some even as recently as 2 or 3 years ago. If one ventures into the nearby woods leading to the lake, one might stumble upon the occasional unusual tombstone. This is the background of my story. In 2019, I bought my first house in this community, completely unaware of the site's eerie past. My wife and I were thrilled to move into our new home, and whether our real estate agent knew about the history, the land was never mentioned to us. The first year was completely normal. Life was peaceful, and then things began to change. In 2020, my wife became pregnant with our first child, and we were overjoyed. We prepared for the baby's arrival and set up the nursery. One day, while I was in the middle of assembling the crib, I carried the heavy box from the garage to the door. I struggled to open the door while balancing the weight when suddenly the door opened by itself. At first, I thought my wife had opened it for me, but she wasn't there. She was still in the nursery. What made this stranger was the weight of the door. It was a heavy, solid door that normally closed by itself. It wasn't a windy day either. I found it strange but brushed it aside. The next event involved my wife. After a long day, I was relaxing in the shower while she started preparing dinner. Suddenly, she stormed into the bathroom, visibly terrified. She explained she had seen a shadow go toward the nursery and assumed it was me. She had started talking to him, but was confused when I didn't answer, only to realize no one was there. Over time, smaller, inexplicable things began to happen. Items were moved from their usual places, but we initially blamed it on forgetfulness. It was only when I decided to rent out this house and buy another within the same community that I learned of the place's history. The potential tenant casually mentioned the old cemetery and the associated lawsuits. I began to research and even discovered an old episode of Unsolved Mysteries detailing the community's experiences. It turned out the cemetery was considered abandoned during construction, sparing the developers any legal responsibility. When we moved into the second house, the strange occurrences began almost immediately. By this time, we had a 6-month-old baby and a toddler. One evening, while my wife and I were in the living room with our toddler, we heard a loud noise. A board from the playpen had somehow flown out of the master bedroom and slammed against the wall with force. We both saw it. We tried to rationalize it, checked air currents, loose toys, or any plausible explanation, but found nothing. Then there is the strange behavior of our 2-year-old daughter, who is autistic. Precisely at 3 a.m., without exception, she wakes up and wants to sleep with us. Sometimes she seems frightened, sometimes completely calm. I'm not sure if it's a learned behavior or something else, but it feels significant. My wife and I have both had disturbing experiences. We frequently see shadows or dark figures out of the corner of our eye. My wife often feels uncomfortable in the kitchen, and I have fleeting moments where I am convinced I saw movement, only to find it vanishes when I look directly. To clarify, I am not claiming definitively that these things are paranormal. There is always the possibility of imagination, paranoia, or coincidence. If there is something at work, it doesn't seem malicious, but I wonder what the history of the land is and what effects the things lying beneath might still have. This all happened about 1.5 years ago. It was autumn and it was cold. My partner and I decided to visit an old mining museum not far from where we lived, about an hour's drive. Although our visit went quite normally go there and drive home afterward, we were also told that the museum has a burial site or grave monument. My ex-boyfriend and I decided to check it out before driving home. The way there was quite close to the parking lot, but it took about 20 to 30 minutes on foot. As we walked, we didn't talk much, but enjoyed the trails and the streams flowing through the small river. On this walk, the area between the mining museum and the grave site seemed much quieter than most historical minings. I remember it felt calm and peaceful, but the closer we got to the grave site, the stranger the feeling in my stomach. It was as if we weren't really alone that day. I remember having butterflies in my stomach, but it also felt like I was being watched, specifically me. Since it was an open field, the grass was visible, but while I walked behind my ex-boyfriend, I felt someone was following me. I noticed my breath was visible in the cold air. It felt stuffy and cramped, and I began to feel uncomfortable. I wondered if it was the right decision to visit this place. It felt like I was intruding into a space that didn't belong to me, and I felt unwanted. Since my ex was a big skeptic, he often said I was overreacting, but this time it felt different. When we arrived at the grave site, there were only the remains of an old tombstone. Not much else was to be seen except that the workers had marked the place with yellow plastic tape. In that moment, I felt increasingly uncomfortable. The feeling didn't go away. On the contrary, it seemed to overwhelm me more and more. It was as if I was standing next to someone who wasn't there, but I felt watched. I think my mistake was asking an open question. We stood around the grave, and since my ex liked reading historical markers, we stayed there for about 30 minutes. I asked into the air, "Is anyone here? You are welcome to follow us." I don't know why I said that, but the presence I felt remained. It felt as if the air had changed as we walked to the grave. Yet as we walked back, it became lighter and normal. My breathing became steady again, and I felt less tense. But then, as he drove me back home, it started. I am a very deep sleeper. Normally, I wouldn't notice a noise. But that night I woke up suddenly as if my soul wanted to leave my body. It was about 3:30 a.m. I had the feeling someone was watching me in the room. I opened my eyes, which were heavy, hoping to fall back asleep, but that wasn't possible. Then I heard something rustling on my closet shelf. I saw my bag, almost as big as a suitcase, moving. I thought it was my mother, with whom I share the room since she often goes to the bathroom at night, but this time it wasn't her. I watched as the bag suddenly fell to the floor. My mother, on the other hand, slept deeply and soundly even though the bag hit the floor loudly. I had the feeling the unknown presence was standing right next to my lamp. When I looked there, the lamp moved visibly, as if someone had shifted it with anger. After the lamp moved, an icy draft suddenly came out of nowhere. The room seemed to shake. My heart raced. The bag had fallen, the lamp had moved, and I felt as if something was trying to break the mirror on my wall. Suddenly, everything was quiet. The air in the room changed and felt exactly like it did back on the way to the grave site. My mother finally woke up, but it was too late to see anything of what happened with her own eyes. To this day, I don't know what followed me, but it clearly made me understand that I was not welcome there. This happened some time ago on a foggy evening. My son Caleb and I had a strange experience I still can't really explain to this day. I had just had an exhausting day at work, picked Caleb up from school, and we were both pretty drained. He was very upset because his chemistry teacher was giving him a hard time for refusing to work with someone on a project. Caleb is a shy boy who avoids crowds and really only feels comfortable around me. To cheer him up, I suggested taking him to his favorite place, Applebee's. To my surprise, however, he asked me instead to visit the grave of my friend Ali. For explanation, Ali was my best friend who played before Caleb was even born. It felt somehow right, so we stopped at a store, bought flowers, and drove to the cemetery. When we arrived, the sky was overcast and fog began to roll in. As soon as I got out of the car, a strange feeling came over me, as if someone was watching us. Caleb felt it too. He even shivered a little and said he felt very nervous, but couldn't explain why. I thought maybe it was because of the difficult day he had at school. We walked with the flowers in hand to Ali's grave. As we walked through the row of tombstones, Caleb suddenly stopped rooted to the spot, stared into the distance, and asked if I had seen that woman. He pointed to a large tree in the distance. I looked, but I couldn't see anything. She just went behind the tree, he said. I squinted but saw nothing. Nevertheless, the atmosphere sent a shiver down my spine. Let's just put the flowers on Allie's grave and go home, I said to him. When we reached the grave, Caleb knelt down, laid his flowers, and said a prayer. He was visibly emotional, and seeing him like that brought tears to my eyes too, especially because he had never met Ali. I laid my flowers down, whispered to Ali how much I miss her, and the grief hit me with full force. We said goodbye and made our way back to the car. The fog had become thicker now, so much so that it was difficult to see more than a few meters ahead. I took Caleb's hand to keep us together. We have to get out of here, I said, trying to sound calm so as not to worry him. And exactly at that moment we saw them. 3 shadows emerging in the fog and blocking our path. I called out, "Who is there?" But there was no answer. Then Caleb, my quiet, shy boy, stepped forward and shouted, "You should leave us alone." But the shadows didn't move. I couldn't tell if they were people or something else entirely. Caleb grabbed my hand and pulled me forward, urging me to run. He led us through the fog, moving fast even though we could barely see where we were going. Then I heard whispering, quiet, unintelligible words, and we didn't stop until we were back at the car. Just as we got in and I tried to back out of the parking space, we saw them. A woman in a long dress with long brown hair coming out near a grave. She looked directly at us. Caleb said that was the same woman he had seen earlier by the tree. I didn't want to find out anything more, stepped on the gas, and we sped away. As you can imagine, we have never returned since.